2 minutes ago, everything changed. Prince William, the future king of the United Kingdom, reportedly broke years of disciplined silence with one sentence that cut through the palace walls: "The palace failed my mother." 4 decades, the royal family survived scandal through strategy, silence, and slow damage control. But this is different. If true, it is not just personal grief. It is an institutional reckoning. For most of his life, Prince William has followed one rule: never publicly attack the institution. He has defended the monarchy, protected its image, maintained unity in front of cameras. Even when old wounds were reopened, through documentaries, interviews, and books, William chose restraint. But Princess Diana's story never truly disappeared. The car crash in 1997 shocked the world. Millions mourned. Flowers filled the streets outside Kensington Palace. And questions lingered. Not about conspiracy, but about culture. About pressure. About isolation. Diana often said she felt alone inside the palace. She described it as cold, structured, controlled. A machine built to protect the crown, not the individual. Now imagine what it means if her eldest son, the future king, suggests that machine failed her. That is not gossip. That is institutional criticism from within. William has always walked a tightrope between loyalty to the crown and loyalty to his mother's memory. As a child, he witnessed the breakdown of the marriage between Diana and King Charles III. He saw media frenzy. He saw palace briefings. He saw silence. And silence can be powerful. The British monarchy survives because it rarely answers emotional accusations directly. It allows time to dull outrage. It leans on continuity. But times have changed. We are in the digital era. Social media shapes narratives instantly. Younger generations question inherited power. Transparency is demanded, not requested. If William is signaling that lessons were not learned fast enough after Diana's suffering, that suggests something deeper. It implies institutional rigidity, a system slow to protect vulnerable members. And here is the tension. William is not an outsider like Prince Harry. He is the heir. He is the future king. When he speaks, markets listen. Governments listen. The Commonwealth listens. So why now? Why reopen a chapter that the palace has carefully managed for nearly 3 decades? There are only a few possible explanations. 1. Internal reform discussions have reached a breaking point. 2. Public perception of the monarchy is under renewed strain. 3. William is preparing to shape the crown in his own image, before he inherits it. This is not about family drama. It is about power structure. If Diana represents the emotional failure of the institution in the 1990s, then William's statement may represent its reckoning in the 2020s. And that shifts the story from past tragedy to present accountability. Because when the future king questions the system must respond. Princess Diana did not lose a marriage. She collided with an institution built to survive at any cost. When she entered the royal family in 1981, she was 20 years old. Shy, emotional, unprepared. What she stepped into was not just a family, it was a constitutional machine designed to protect the crown above all else. And if Prince William now says the palace failed her, he may be admitting that the machine worked exactly as designed. When Diana Spencer married then Prince Charles in a global fairytale watched by hundreds of millions, the palace saw stability, youth, a future queen. But behind the ceremony at St. Paul's Cathedral, the reality was more complicated. Charles had history, emotional attachments, expectations, duty. Diana had emotion, vulnerability, humanity. The palace had one priority: continuity of the crown. That difference shaped everything. Diana quickly became more popular than the institution itself. Crowds came for her. Cameras followed her. Headlines centered on her compassion, her fashion, her connection with ordinary people. She shook hands with AIDS patients when others would not. She hugged children in hospitals. She walked through landmine fields. The public saw warmth. The institution saw unpredictability. Here is the structural tension. Monarchies survive on control. Controlled messaging. Controlled appearances. Controlled hierarchy. Diana disrupted that control simply by being authentic. As the marriage deteriorated, media leaks intensified. Anonymous briefings appeared in tabloids. Narratives were shaped behind closed doors. The palace rarely defended her publicly. Instead, it protected the image of the crown. In institutional terms, this is risk management. Protect the brand. Absorb the scandal. Outlast the headlines. But individuals are not brands. Diana struggled with mental health. She spoke about feeling isolated. She described self-harm. She told friends she felt unsupported. When she gave the 1995 BBC Panorama interview, she bypassed palace communication channels entirely. That interview was seismic. "3 of us in this marriage," she said. It embarrassed the monarchy. It broke protocol. It exposed private pain. The palace response was swift but measured. Damage control. Separation formalized. Divorce finalized in 1996. From an institutional lens, the crisis was contained. From a human lens, the damage was permanent. When Diana died in Paris in 1997, public grief turned into public anger. Why were flags not lowered immediately? Why did the royal family remain in Balmoral? Why did silence feel cold? The Queen eventually addressed the nation live. It stabilized the moment. But the perception lingered. The institution had struggled to show emotion. If Prince William now says the palace failed his mother, he is not necessarily accusing individuals. He may be critiquing structure. An institution that prioritized order over empathy. Protocol over protection. Image over intervention. And here is the deeper implication. If the palace failed Diana, what safeguards exist today? What reforms were truly implemented? And are they sufficient for the next generation of royals under intense media scrutiny? This is no longer about the 1990s. It is about whether the monarchy learned from its most painful chapter, or merely survived it. If you believe the monarchy truly changed after Diana, comment reformed. If you believe it only adapted its strategy, comment strategic. Prince William has lived with 2 identities his entire life. He is Diana's son. And he is the future king. Those roles do not always align. If he now suggests the palace failed his mother, he is not just speaking as a grieving child. He is speaking as a constitutional heir questioning the system he is destined to lead. That tension is explosive. Because when loyalty to family meets loyalty to the crown, something must give. From the moment Diana died, William was placed inside a delicate framework. He was allowed to grieve, but privately. He was allowed to remember, but carefully. He was expected to represent stability. At just 15 years old, he walked behind his mother's coffin through London streets watched by the world. That image defined a generation. It also symbolized something deeper, the monarchy's ability to turn personal tragedy into public ritual. William grew up understanding one truth. The institution always comes first. But trauma does not disappear simply because protocol demands composure. As he matured, William rarely spoke publicly about Diana beyond carefully measured tributes. Anniversary speeches. Charitable references. Emotional, but contained. There was no direct criticism of the palace structure. That restraint was strategic. The monarchy depends on unity at the top. Public fractures weaken confidence. Confidence underpins constitutional monarchy. Yet the modern era pressures silence. Prince Harry's interviews, particularly with Oprah Winfrey, reopened institutional criticism. Harry described feeling unsupported. Meghan described isolation. Allegations of structural insensitivity resurfaced. The public debate intensified. William responded minimally. "Very much not a racist family," he said once. Brief. Controlled. But behind the scenes, observers note a pattern. William increasingly emphasizes mental health advocacy, early intervention, emotional support structures, public vulnerability in moderated form. That is not accidental. It reflects an understanding of what went wrong in the 1990s. If he now signals that the palace failed Diana, the statement is layered. Layer 1, personal acknowledgement. Layer 2, institutional warning. Layer 3, leadership positioning. William is preparing for kingship in a radically different media environment. Social media dismantles secrecy. Investigative journalism moves faster. Younger audiences are skeptical of inherited privilege. The monarchy's survival depends on perceived moral legitimacy. And moral legitimacy depends on accountability. Here is the strategic calculation. By acknowledging past failure, William may be strengthening future authority. Leaders who admit institutional shortcomings often gain credibility. They signal reform without dismantling structure. But there is risk. If the palace failed Diana, who within it was responsible? Systems do not fail abstractly. They are operated by people. Advisors, courtiers, senior royals. Naming structural failure invites scrutiny. And scrutiny challenges continuity. William stands at the intersection of grief and governance. Too much criticism destabilizes the crown. Too little risks appearing indifferent to history. The balance is precise. If this moment is real, it may mark a generational shift. A future king who believes survival requires transparency, not silence. But reform inside a 1,000-year-old institution is slow. Tradition resists speed. Protocol resists emotion. The question is no longer whether Diana was failed. The question is whether William intends to redesign the system that failed her before he inherits it. The British monarchy does not panic. It absorbs. It delays. It recalibrates. For decades, the palace survived wars, abdications, divorces, and televised scandals using one core strategy: never react emotionally in public. If Prince William has now challenged that legacy, he is confronting the very playbook that preserved the crown through its darkest moments. And that playbook is older than any living royal. To understand what this means, we need to understand how the institution operates. The monarchy is not simply a family living in castles. It is a constitutional framework supported by advisors, private secretaries, press offices, and carefully layered communication structures. Every public statement is vetted. Every appearance is choreographed. Every silence is deliberate. This is not coldness. It is design. After the abdication crisis of 1936, when King Edward VIII stepped down to marry Wallis Simpson, the monarchy nearly collapsed. The lesson learned was clear: personal emotion must never overpower institutional duty. That principle guided Queen Elizabeth II throughout her 70-year reign. During political crises, family scandals, even personal loss, she maintained restraint. The crown must appear steady, especially when the world is unstable. But Diana did not operate within that code. She spoke emotionally. She shared vulnerability. She connected directly with the public. Her 1995 Panorama interview bypassed palace filters entirely. From the institution's perspective, that was destabilizing. The palace response was consistent with its playbook: limit escalation, avoid public confrontation, protect hierarchy. It worked in one sense. The monarchy survived. But survival is not the same as justice. Public memory does not separate emotional truth from institutional calculation. Many people believe Diana was left exposed to media attacks without adequate protection. Whether fully accurate or not, perception shaped legacy. Now consider today's context. Modern media cycles are relentless. Social platforms amplify outrage instantly. A single narrative can trend worldwide in minutes. Silence, once a stabilizing tool, can now appear evasive. If William is signaling that the palace failed Diana, he is indirectly questioning whether the old playbook still works. Because here is the strategic dilemma. The monarchy's power rests on continuity, ritual, stability, the illusion of timelessness. But relevance depends on adaptation. Too much transparency risks weakening mystique. Too little risks alienating the public. Institutional power survives through legitimacy. Legitimacy comes from public trust. And trust is fragile. William understands this. He grew up watching public sentiment shift rapidly after Diana's death. He saw how initial silence from the royal family led to visible public frustration. Only after the Queen addressed the nation did tensions ease. That moment was a turning point. The palace realized emotional visibility mattered. But structural culture changes slowly. Courtiers still operate within hierarchies. Decisions still move cautiously. Reputation management still favors containment over confession. If the future king is openly acknowledging institutional failure, even in limited language, that represents a subtle but meaningful departure from historical instinct. He would not be dismantling the crown. He would be modernizing its defense. Do you think the palace's strategy of silence still protects the monarchy, or does it create more damage today? Share your view below. The palace does not just manage events. It manages memory. For nearly 3 decades, Princess Diana's story has been filtered through documentaries, biographies, dramatizations, and royal responses. But memory is unstable. It shifts with each new interview, each new revelation. If Prince William has now said the palace failed his mother, he is stepping directly into a battle over narrative control, and that battle defines modern monarchy. Public institutions understand one critical rule: whoever shapes the story shapes the legacy. After Diana's death in 1997, the immediate narrative was grief. Global mourning. Human tragedy. The royal family eventually aligned itself with that narrative, emphasizing loss and remembrance. But over time, the story evolved. Books questioned palace conduct. Journalists revisited old briefings. Former staff spoke anonymously. The BBC investigation into the Panorama interview later revealed serious ethical breaches by reporter Martin Bashir. That finding shifted part of the blame away from Diana and toward media manipulation. Yet the broader question never disappeared. Was Diana adequately supported by the institution she married into? Prince Harry amplified that question years later. In interviews and documentaries, he suggested systemic patterns remained unchanged. He framed his and Meghan's struggles as echoes of Diana's experience. The palace responded in measured language. Brief statements. Limited engagement. No emotional rebuttal. That response was consistent with institutional tradition. But it allowed external voices to dominate the conversation. William, however, has historically taken a different approach. When the BBC investigation concluded that deceit played a role in securing Diana's interview, William released a strongly worded statement. He condemned the methods used. He defended his mother's dignity. He criticized institutional failures within journalism. Notice what he did there. He acknowledged failure, but located it outside the palace. If he now suggests the palace itself failed Diana, that shifts the axis of accountability. And accountability reshapes narrative power. From a strategic perspective, this could be preemptive positioning. By acknowledging past shortcomings internally, William prevents critics from weaponizing them externally. It transforms accusation into admission, and admission into reform potential. But it also reopens emotional terrain. The public still feels protective of Diana's memory. She represents vulnerability within a powerful structure. Her image is tied to compassion, not protocol. If William aligns himself openly with her grievances, he strengthens emotional legitimacy with younger audiences. Yet he risks unsettling senior institutional figures who prefer continuity over re-examination. This is the delicate calculus of modern monarchy. Media dynamics no longer allow slow narrative containment. Silence invites speculation. Controlled transparency may be the only sustainable strategy. William understands the optics. He understands generational perception. He knows the crown's long-term survival depends on more than tradition, it depends on credibility. By entering the narrative arena himself, he signals leadership. But leadership in this context means something unprecedented, confronting the institution from within, not defending it at all costs. And that changes the power balance between palace, press, and public memory. If Prince William has publicly implied that the palace failed Princess Diana, the impact does not stop with history. It lands directly in the present, and on King Charles III. Because Diana's story is inseparable from Charles' past. Any suggestion of institutional failure inevitably touches the reign of the current monarch. And that creates a sensitive, high-stakes dynamic inside Buckingham Palace. King Charles III waited decades to ascend the throne. His reign began under intense scrutiny but also with public sympathy after Queen Elizabeth II's passing. Stability was the priority. Continuity was the message. Charles has worked to modernize aspects of the monarchy, slimming down working royals, emphasizing environmental leadership, maintaining a disciplined media approach. But Diana's legacy has always hovered quietly in the background. For many in the public, Charles and Diana represent a chapter of emotional imbalance. Even though both moved forward, even though Camilla is now queen, the emotional memory of the 1990s remains powerful. If William signals that the palace failed his mother, observers will inevitably ask, does that include failures during Charles' leadership as Prince of Wales? This is where institutional nuance becomes critical. The monarchy distinguishes between personal relationships and systemic function. From an institutional viewpoint, Diana's struggles were framed as marital issues combined with intense press intrusion. But if William's words suggest structural failure, then responsibility broadens. It becomes less about one marriage and more about how the institution handles vulnerability. That reframing could indirectly soften personal blame on Charles, by shifting focus toward systems rather than individuals. However, public interpretation may not be so precise. Modern audiences often personalize institutional criticism. Headlines simplify. Narratives compress complexity into conflict. William challenges father's era is a more clickable story than future king advocates structural modernization. This is the risk. At the same time, there is strategic opportunity. If Charles and William appear aligned in acknowledging past shortcomings and promoting reform, the monarchy could present a united generational front. That would signal evolution rather than division. Historically, monarchies survive when transitions appear smooth. Internal conflict weakens confidence. Coordinated messaging strengthens it. So the key question becomes, was this statement impulsive or coordinated? If coordinated, it may represent the beginning of a broader institutional repositioning. A subtle admission that emotional intelligence must now be embedded into palace culture. If not coordinated, it could create internal strain at the highest level. Remember, the monarchy is not merely symbolic. It intersects with government, diplomacy, and Commonwealth relations. Perception of instability has geopolitical implications. William is not only a son speaking about his mother. He is a statesman-in-waiting signaling how he intends to rule. Reform carries risk. Silence carries risk. The difference lies in control. If the future king leads the conversation, he shapes it. If critics lead it, the palace reacts. There is one name that immediately surfaces when Prince William speaks about institutional failure: Prince Harry. For years, Harry has argued that the palace did not protect his wife, just as it did not protect his mother. If William now acknowledges that Diana was failed, he is stepping into territory his brother has occupied alone, and that changes the dynamics of one of the most public royal fractures in modern history. Prince Harry's departure from royal duties in 2020 was not quiet. It was seismic. Interviews followed. A Netflix documentary series. A memoir. Each platform carried a consistent theme: the institution prioritizes image over individual well-being. Harry's claims often pointed back to Diana. He described patterns repeating: media hostility, limited internal support, emotional isolation. The palace responded cautiously. Brief written statements. No televised rebuttals. No public family confrontation. The strategy was containment through restraint. William, during this period, avoided escalation. He did not engage publicly in narrative combat. He maintained composure and continued royal duties. That posture reinforced stability. But if he now says the palace failed Diana, critics will inevitably draw parallels to Harry's earlier accusations. The difference is credibility weight. Harry speaks as a former working royal outside the system. William speaks as the future head of that system. When an insider validates even part of an outsider's critique, perception shifts. However, nuance matters. Acknowledging past institutional failure does not automatically validate every modern grievance. William may be distinguishing between historical shortcomings and current safeguards. He may be implying that lessons were learned after Diana's death, even if they came too late for her. Still, the optics are delicate. If William aligns too closely with Harry's framing, it could amplify narratives of internal dysfunction. If he distances too sharply, it risks appearing dismissive of genuine institutional reflection. The monarchy must manage not only public perception, but internal cohesion. Brothers divided weaken symbolic unity. A future king publicly acknowledging systemic error while his brother remains estranged creates emotional complexity. But there is also strategic opportunity here. William could reclaim moral authority by demonstrating that reform is being addressed internally, without dismantling the institution itself. That approach positions him as a reformer from within, rather than a critic from outside. Historically, institutions survive when they absorb criticism and adapt. They struggle when criticism becomes external and uncontrolled. The Harry factor intensifies scrutiny. If William's statement is perceived as an olive branch toward institutional accountability, it may indirectly ease public pressure. If perceived as a partial validation of long-standing grievances, it may reignite debate. Either way, the narrative landscape shifts. This is no longer simply a sibling dispute. It becomes a question of institutional evolution versus institutional defense. And that question will define how the monarchy enters its next generation. If Prince William truly said, "The palace failed my mother," history will remember this moment. Not as gossip, not as drama, but as a pivot. Because when the future king questions the system that shaped him, he signals change. And in a monarchy built on tradition, change is never casual. It is calculated. It is strategic. And it shapes the crown for decades. The British monarchy has survived for over 1,000 years by adapting slowly. It has endured civil wars, abdications, global conflicts, divorces, and scandals. It evolves, but never suddenly. William understands this better than anyone. He has spent his life studying not just royal duty, but royal survival. He saw how Queen Elizabeth II preserved stability through restraint. He saw how public pressure after Diana's death forced emotional recalibration. He witnessed how modern media transformed private matters into global spectacles. He also witnessed how silence can be misread. If he is now signaling that the palace failed Diana, he may be doing something carefully structured. Step 1. Acknowledge emotional truth. Step 2. Frame it as historical lesson. Step 3. Position himself as the architect of a more responsive monarchy. This is not rebellion. It is recalibration. A future king who can admit institutional shortcomings appears human. Accountability builds credibility. Credibility strengthens authority. But modernization must be measured. The monarchy's power rests partly on mystique, ritual, continuity. If it becomes overly reactive or overly transparent, it risks losing the distance that defines it. So William's challenge is precise. He must show empathy without destabilizing hierarchy. He must honor Diana's memory without undermining his father's reign. He must modernize culture without eroding structure. That is leadership inside a constitutional monarchy. Public trust is the ultimate currency. Polling over recent years has shown generational divides in attitudes toward the monarchy. Younger citizens demand authenticity. Older citizens prioritize tradition. William stands between those audiences. By addressing the past openly, he may be building a bridge to the future. The deeper question is this: will the palace follow his lead? Institutions resist rapid change. Advisors protect precedent. Internal culture shapes decision-making long before public statements are crafted. But every monarchy eventually reflects its sovereign. When William becomes king, his worldview will define tone, policy emphasis, and communication style. If his perspective includes acknowledgement of past institutional failure, the crown under his reign may prioritize emotional intelligence as much as ceremonial continuity. And that would be a lasting legacy of Diana's story. Not tragedy alone. Transformation. The monarchy does not fall in a single moment. It evolves through subtle shifts in language, posture, and accountability. If this is one of those moments, we are watching the early blueprint of a future reign. The palace survived Diana. The question now is whether it will fully learn from her. Do you believe Prince William will fundamentally reform the monarchy when he becomes king, or will tradition ultimately limit change? Comment your perspective below and subscribe for continued analysis on the power shifts shaping the royal family.